Imagine for a second being forced from your home, everything you've ever known, and all in the name of religion.
Millions face that reality.
Yeah.
During the 1947 partition of British India, an event that created Pakistan but also led to decades of turmoil.
It's a really complex story. We're going to be taking a look at Pakistan's journey, a nation trying to balance its Islamic identity with all of the demands of a modern state.
Yeah, it's a story full of contradictions. I mean, even the idea of Pakistan, a homeland for Indian Muslims, was supposed to unify.
Right.
But the way it was created, with East and West Pakistan separated by 1,000 miles of India, it practically guaranteed instability right from the start.
And it wasn't just geography. The partition itself was brutal.
Absolutely.
The sources we have describe mass displacement, horrific violence, just deep scars left on both sides of this.
And it's crucial to understand how this violent birth, really shaped Pakistan's identity early on.
Yeah.
Early Pakistani historians often emphasize what they saw as the tyranny of Hindus.
Right.
Almost creating this narrative of victimhood to justify, why Pakistan needed to exist.
So they're leaning heavily on the two-nation theory.
Exactly.
The idea that Hindus and Muslims are just fundamentally different and can't coexist.
Right.
But doesn't that create a strange paradox?
It absolutely does, because Pakistan, founded on this religious distinction,
Right,
ended up with fewer Muslims than India, and it had significant non-Muslim populations, especially in East Pakistan. So it immediately challenged the very basis of the two-nation theory.
So it seems like they were trying to build a national identity
Yeah.
on some very shaky ground.
On very shaky ground.
How did that impact the early years of Pakistan? Like, what happened?
It led to a constant struggle for stability. I mean, early governments were weak. There were political assassinations happening all the time. And the military saw an opportunity to step in, as this stabilizing force.
And that brings us to the first military coup in 1958, led by General Ayub Khan. He promised economic development. He promised a firm hand. And, at first it seemed like he delivered.
Ayub Khan's rule is really interesting because it's a study in unintended consequences.
Okay.
He did bring about some economic growth,
Right.
but his policies often favored West Pakistan over the East, and this fueled existing resentment among Bengalis who already felt marginalized both politically and economically.
It wasn't just economics, though, was it? I mean, the sources point to cultural tensions as well, particularly around language.
That's a key point. The central government insisted on Urdu as the only national language.
Oh, wow.
Which was seen as a direct attack on Bengali culture.
Yeah.
And the 1952 language movement, where students were killed protesting for recognition of Bengali, became a lasting symbol of that resistance.
So you have this growing sense of Bengali nationalism.
Yeah.
Fueled by economic disparity and cultural tension.
Absolutely.
Did this contribute to the eventual breakup of Pakistan?
Without a doubt. And these tensions were further inflamed by the policies of General Zia-ul-Haq, who came to power in another coup in 1977, and he ushered in an era of Islamization, attempting to unify the nation through religion.
How did that play out? It seems counterintuitive that emphasizing religious identity in an already diverse nation would lead to unity.
Well, Zia's policies had a profound impact, and not always in the way that he intended. He introduced Islamic laws, promoted social conservatism, and marginalized minorities. This alienated many, particularly in East Pakistan, and it contributed to the rise of religious extremism.
Wow.
Which is a force that continues to challenge Pakistan today.
It sounds like he was trying to solve a problem by doubling down on the very thing that was causing the division.
You could say that, but there's another layer to this. While promoting this strict Islamic image, Zia's regime also oversaw the growth of a parallel economy fueled by the Afghan war and drug trafficking.
Oh, wow.
It's a stark example of the contradictions that marked this era.
So preaching piety on one hand while benefiting from illicit activities on the other.
Yeah.
What a tangled web.
And this web entangled Pakistan even further. Zia's Islamization project inadvertently created a legal framework for extremist groups to operate, ultimately leading to the growth of organizations that would later destabilize the region. The ripple effects of Zia's policies, particularly the rise of extremism, is something Pakistan is still dealing with today. And it's a struggle that's played out against, a backdrop of fragile democracies and this persistent military influence.
Yeah, because even after Zia's death in 1988, it wasn't like a smooth transition to civilian rule. It seemed like every time democracy gained a foothold, it was undermined by corruption or military intervention.
That's been a recurring theme, unfortunately. Benazir Bhutto's election in 1988 was a landmark moment. I mean, it was the first female prime minister in a Muslim-majority country.
Yeah.
But her 2 terms were marred by allegations of corruption, and political maneuvering, both from her opponents and within her own party.
And her husband, Asif Zardari, didn't exactly help with the perception of corruption.
Right.
The sources even mentioned a nickname, Mr. 10%, implying he was taking kickbacks on deals.
It really highlights, a deep-rooted problem in Pakistan's political system. Even when there's a genuine desire for democratic reform, it's incredibly difficult to overcome these entrenched systems of patronage and graft.
And of course, the military was never far from the scene in 1999. General Pervez Musharraf staged a coup ousting Nawaz Sharif, who was in his second term as prime minister.
Musharraf's rule was particularly complex. He came to power just as the global landscape was shifting after 9/11.
Right.
He tried to position Pakistan as a key ally in the U.S.-led war on terror, while also pushing for internal reforms and modernization.
Wasn't that a tricky balancing act, though?
Oh, absolutely.
On the one hand, appeasing the U.S. was crucial for economic aid and international standing, but on the other hand, siding with the U.S. in a war against Islamic extremism could fuel the very problem Pakistan was facing internally.
Exactly, and Musharraf's methods didn't really help. He introduced this idea of guided democracy, which essentially gave her sweeping powers while allowing for very limited political activity. A lot of people saw it as a thinly veiled attempt to just maintain control.
The sources describe him manipulating elections, disqualifying opponents, even trying to control the judiciary.
Yeah.
It sounds more like controlled democracy than guided democracy.
That's a fair assessment, and all of this was happening while Pakistan was becoming a nuclear-armed state.
Wow.
So imagine the complexities of managing domestic politics, navigating international relations, and dealing with the responsibilities of nuclear weapons, all while trying to maintain your grip on power.
Yeah, it's a recipe for tension, to say the least, and it seems Musharraf eventually succumbed to those pressures.
His fall from grace was pretty dramatic. The assassination of Benazir Bhutto in 2007, coupled with growing unrest and, a resurgent insurgency in the tribal areas, all contributed to his eventual resignation in 2008.
And that opened the door for, you guessed it, another round of democratic elections. Asif Zardari Bhutto's widower became president.
It seems like Pakistan's history is full of these cyclical turns, where hope for democracy clashes with these deeply entrenched power structures. It's a pattern that's proven difficult to break. Zardari faced immense challenges, a struggling economy, a relentless insurgency, and a society that was increasingly polarized by political and religious divisions. He did manage to complete his term, which was a feat in itself given the circumstances.
But did anything fundamentally change, or was it just more of the same political maneuvering and corruption that had plagued previous governments?
Zardari's government did make some progress in terms of devolving power to the provinces.
Okay.
But allegations of corruption persisted. It became clear that addressing the root causes of Pakistan's problems would require a more systemic approach.
And lurking behind all of this was the ever-present military establishment.
Even when they weren't directly in power, the military's influence was undeniable. I mean, they control vast economic interests, the intelligence agencies, and they have this deep network of patronage. It's often referred to as the deep state.
For someone new to this topic, what does deep state really mean in the context of Pakistan?
It refers to a network of individuals, often within the military and intelligence agencies, who exert significant influence on government policy and decision-making, even when they're not officially in power.
So even during periods of civilian rule,
right,
there's this underlying tension, a constant push and pull between elected leaders and this entrenched power of the military. It sounds like a recipe for instability.
It certainly creates challenges for democratic consolidation, and these challenges were brought into sharp focus during the 2013 elections, a pivotal moment in Pakistan's recent history.
The 2013 elections were hailed as a historic moment for Pakistan. Right, for the first time, a civilian government completed its term and transferred power to another civilian government through a democratic process.
Right.
Did this signal like a real shift in Pakistan's political landscape?
It was definitely a positive development, a step towards, consolidating democracy. But the underlying challenges that have plagued Pakistan for decades, they didn't just vanish.
So despite the progress, those old fault lines were still there. What did this mean for the newly elected government? What were the key issues they had to address?
Well, they faced a whole bunch of problems. The economy was a mess. Balance of payments, crisis, high inflation. lack of foreign investment.
Yeah.
The security situation was really precarious with, ongoing terrorist attacks and an insurgency in the tribal areas. And then there was the ever-present issue of the military's role in politics.
It sounds like an incredibly daunting task.
It was.
How did they handle that issue of the military? Was there any attempt to, curb their influence?
It was a delicate dance. They had to assert civilian control, but they also had to avoid direct confrontation with the military establishment.
Right.
So they made some efforts to improve transparency and accountability within the military, but they were very cautious not to push too hard too fast.
That makes sense. You don't want to provoke a backlash from an institution that has a history of intervening in politics. Yeah. But what about those other pressing issues like the economy and the security situation? How did they tackle those?
Well, on the economic front, they implemented austerity measures and sought financial assistance from international lenders. They also tried to attract foreign investment, but that was met with limited success, mostly because of security concerns and perceptions of corruption.
And on the security front, it seems like Pakistan has been fighting a war against terrorism that never ends.
Right.
Was there any progress made in that area?
They did make some gains through military operations against militant groups.
Okay.
But the root causes of extremism, things like poverty, lack of education, social marginalization, those remain largely unaddressed.
It feels like we're seeing this pattern again and again, tackling the symptoms without really getting at the underlying disease. Is that a fair assessment?
To a certain extent, yes. Pakistan's problems are deeply entrenched and they're all interconnected. Solving them requires a comprehensive long-term strategy, one that focuses not just on military solutions, but also on economic development, social justice, strengthening democratic institutions.
So where does Pakistan stand today after decades of political turmoil, military coups, economic struggles? Is there hope for a brighter future?
Pakistan's at a crossroads. It has the potential to become a stable, prosperous, democratic nation.
Right.
But realizing that potential is going to require bold leadership, a commitment to reform, and a willingness to confront some very difficult truths that choices made in the coming years are going to be crucial in determining Pakistan's trajectory.
As we wrap up this look into Pakistan's journey, it's clear that the nation faces immense challenges, but amidst those challenges, there's also resilience, there's a vibrant civil society, and there's a young population that's eager for change. It's a story that's still being written, and the ending is far from certain. What kind of future will Pakistan forge for itself? That's a question for the Pakistani people and for the world to contemplate.